Right. So I do have one warning before we begin today, is that if you stick around for this session, you might walk out as a Salesforce security ninja. So stay and pay attention at your own risk. And Mark, can you tell us what are we going to be talking about today?
We're going to cover what it kind of says in the description there, some basic strategy overall, some best practices, and go over some tools that are available in the ecosystem to help you safeguard your Salesforce organization. We're going to focus on the application layer. So this is strictly about the tools, best practices, and the strategy you should take to make sure you are securing your organization. And look, probably some of the things you're doing, but I think there are some things here that we all know we should be doing that we're not. So we're going to explore some of that stuff.
And just because this presentation is going to Dreamforce, we have to show the slide and give you a quick reminder that Salesforce is a publicly traded company and customers should base their purchasing decisions on products and services that are currently available.
At a Dreamforce a couple of years ago, I heard a rumor that someone actually sang that Safe Harbor just presenting it. I would have loved to hear that.
The whole text?
Yeah. Well, this is with COVID. This is the older version, might have been smaller.
That is hilarious. I would love to hear that as well.
Yeah.
All right, a little bit about us. My name is Alicia Dvorkina. I am a Salesforce delivery specialist. I guess I can call myself that. I am a founder of Humara Solution, a Salesforce consulting company. I've been working with Salesforce for about 12 years now, really covering all kind of roles from business analyst, solo admin, admin on large team, project manager, director, and so forth. And just like Mark, I'm a runner, but I call myself an amateur runner. And Mark is actually my inspiration on both running world and Salesforce world in terms of his depth of knowledge and skill sets there. Mark.
Okay, so Mark, just to be clear, in the pictures, the one on the bottom, that's me. So wearing the cool sunglasses, so just you don't confuse the two of us. I'm a parent, obviously. I run. I'm a Salesforce architect for a company called AdCo Corporation. I've been in Salesforce space. I actually go on my LinkedIn profile to check because I remember it looks like it's 13 years. Excuse me, 13 years. I have a smattering of certifications, and I'm excited to be here to talk about security. So, by the way, if you want to know what AdCo Corporation does or is, you may not have heard of them. They're one of the Fortune 500 companies. They actually manufacture farm equipment, so tractors and combines. And John Deere is our biggest competitor in the United States. It's a global company. So
awesome. All right, moving on. And not to scare anyone away, please stay. But to set clear expectations for today's session, it is built with it in advanced admins in mind, because we are not planning to spend too much time on basic data models and security features. And if you came to learn about profiles and permission sets and roles, this is not the right class for you. Instead, our goal is to cover advanced best practices, tools, so you can understand how all of these features holistically help you protect your org and manage your risks. And so if you realize this is not for you, that's okay. You can drop off. We value your time. We won't judge you, maybe just a little bit, but we will do our best with Mark to ensure that there is enough one to learn something new today. Bao, welcome. And we already started, and this will be a recording if you need to refer to it afterwards. Before we dive into specific tools and best practices on the Salesforce platform, let's take a step back and gain a panoramic view. I am definitely a person, the why person, who always asks, but why? So I like to understand, why are we using profiles, permissions? Why Salesforce dictates certain best practices? So we're going to go into the why section right now. If here, we probably don't need to explain to you why security is so important and why in this era of rising dependency on digital devices, and increased sophistication of cybersecurity and cyber criminals, companies should step up their attempts of safeguarding the data from threats and incidents. And according to Gartner, organizations will spend a collective $188 billion on information security and risk management products and services in 2023. And according to the IBM's Cost of Data Breach report, the cost of data breach in 2023 is over $4 million, with 83% of organizations having multiple breaches. So yes, it can become very costly if you don't have a proper security strategy and you are not following the industry best practices. And regrettably, many companies don't realize that the threats could also be coming from within. And yes, from within the sales force as well. It could be departing employee who takes the data to the next job. It could be employees changing the roles within organizations and who are left with the old permissions. These with malicious intent who want to harm company's reputation by leaking data. It could be just negligent employees who don't have bad intention, but make an error and can subject the company to security threats. Privileged user abuse, which occurs when users are granted more access rights than they need to perform the duties. Compromised credentials, where a user's account information such as username and password are in the possession of the wrong person. And third-party apps that are integrated with your Salesforce and access your system and the data. Sounds pretty stressful, right? Does anyone cross any of these scenarios before? If you have, feel free to drop a plus or me in the chat. But what do we do with it? Or how do we deal with this? In 1974, Jerome Salter stated in the monthly publication of the computer journal, Communications of the ACM, every program and every privileged user of the system should operate using the least amount of privilege necessary to complete the job. This was first formulation of what is now known as Principle of Least Privilege, or POLP. And even though the concept of POLP has its roots in computer science and information security a few decades back, over time, POLP has evolved from a theoretical concept to a widely adopted security best practice. And now, Principle of Least Privilege is a cornerstone of the Zero Trust strategy, or what Salesforce calls a Zero Trust strategy. So, Zero Trust strategy advocates for the notion that organizations should not automatically trust any user or device, whether inside or outside the network by default, which means that we should grant users and systems only the minimum level of access and permissions necessary to perform the specific tasks. And it's not only relevant to human users, but also to applications, services, and connected devices. And this principle can and should be applied to Salesforce security too. It's easy to accidentally or on purpose overgrant permissions, and very common to inherit an org with overprivileged users. For these reasons, Salesforce teams should be applying Principle of Least Privilege to the users and third-party integrations. But security is always a shared responsibility. We cannot forget that. Salesforce secures the platform, but once the company inputs the data, it's up to the organization to protect its information. Without an extra layer of security beyond what Salesforce application has incorporated, or the Salesforce incorporated into its own platform, we can see the data that is stolen, lost, compromised, deleted, exposed, breached. So this can incur a variety of consequences, from competitive losses, revenue losses, to fines, legal fees, and loss of trust from the customers. And counting solely on Salesforce as an application without embracing the shared responsibility and best practices is a major pitfall in effective Salesforce management. As a Salesforce guardians, we should implement a zero-trust Salesforce backed up by best practices and tools to ensure our business teams and leaders can sleep at night. And it goes even further beyond just you and the Salesforce, because it's everybody. It's all about your leadership. It's about your users. So one within the organization is responsible to protect your customer data.
Okay, so let's start talking about taking the strategy that Alicia's talking about, the zero trust, trust no one, and start applying it to looking at the lens of some best practices. So these are some questions that we should be considering or looking at or thinking about in terms of security. And we took the development model sort of, it kind of built on that. So when you're building a solution or you're thinking about your org, let's look at from the lens of a solution, understanding, designing it, building it, testing it, and then auditing it. And there are certain things that are from a security lens. So let's jump into understand first. So these are some questions or ideas that you should be looking at or thinking about. And this is not exhaustive or full everything. You could find hundreds of them, but these are ideas or things that you should be start thinking about and exploring. Like obvious ones, but let's say them out loud. What access is required? Who should have access? The second part of that, does their managing access burned me a few times. We never thought about the managers. Should they have access? Should not have access? What happens with people who go on vacation? So, and do they get their access taken away afterwards, right? Another good question to ask is why do they need access? And is there any inherent risks in that? Is there any compliance data? What about third-party apps or integrations? Something to think about is some apps and integrations take your data off platform and put it someplace else. Are they secure? What's going on with that data, right? How will access be provisioned or deprovisioned, right? What's the plan around that? And does any access require approval? These are the kind of questions that you're thinking about to kind of making sure you're implementing that zero trust. So that's from an understanding perspective. Now let's move on to designing. So when you're designing something, is the solution compatible with the access requirements? Seems obvious to ask that question, but I've been in a few situations where we would go down the path of using a lookup versus a master detail and end up being, oops, we chose the wrong one and it wasn't compatible. So go back and fix that, and that took time and effort. So again, it seems obvious, but something to think about, right? How will your security solution or processes around the security scale? Think about it from a provisioning perspective. If you're provisioning 5 users, no big deal. If you're provisioning 500 users, maybe you need to think about something different, right? And on top of that, in terms of your organization, what are the access requirements? Are they different based on a user's role or title or department? How do you know? How is that going to be involved? What do you need to do to contain that or document that? And are there any external users? Community users, employee users who use in the communities, for example, so whatever, right? They have different access controls too to consider when you design your solutions. Are you have any credentials that you have to secure? Are they being secured? And that's actually a pretty big deal. I used to be a consultant in the previous life, but Eric kind of hinted at the top of the call, and I've seen some pretty poor past practices where passwords were literally in the code. Like I have your code, I have your password and username now to access these systems. So again, are you thinking about how you're going to secure credentials and making sure that zero trust is being implemented? And on top of all that stuff, and Alicia will talk about this later on, what sharing tools need to be leveraged to actually make sure sharing is kept intact and security is maintained. So then when you go from designing, let's start about building a little bit. So what are the kind of data relationships are you implementing? What are those mechanisms to implement the sharing? What are the tools or automations, flows, Apex, whatever is necessary to actually implement that sharing? Are there any considerations there, right? Are you thinking about the user context? So keep in mind, platform events and some other automations change user context sometimes. So are we inadvertently exposing data by not maintaining user context or being aware of that? And there's also external data objects. If you're using external data, sharing is tricky. External data, that's part of the solution. So are you thinking about those kinds of things? And now let's move on to testing. Yeah, users, God bless them, but they do the most unexpected things sometimes. And one of the things you got to make sure is, as much as tedious as it is, are you testing more than the happy path? I mean, everyone, I've done it many, many times. I just simply tested the happy path and not considered the unhappy path. But like the example, the little joke in the bottom there about the QA engineer. So you have to test the unhappy path, because sometimes when things happen like that, you can inadvertently expose data if you're not careful with that. Have you tested with different roles, titles, departments, sessions, whatever? How about external users for that process? Have you done your regression testing to make sure something that was secure before has not been secure before? Has there been a code review? Are they following best practices in terms of the code? And when they write code, you have to write unit tests. Are they actually testing the running code as specified users, which is the best practice? So you got to make sure your testing is solid to make sure you validate your code. Now, what's great about unit tests, by the way, is that's kind of a regression test you could reuse over and over again. As long as the unit tests are written well, you could use them as an opportunity to test and validate. And finally, and this is probably, from my perspective, is auditing. I used to be a primary admin on a large org a couple of years ago, and periodically I didn't schedule it, I should have scheduled it, but I would periodically look through stuff to make sure nothing surprising was happening, right? Like I would challenge sometimes my team members, are these users' access still relevant? And one of the questions is, how many of your users have view all data or modify all data? Do you really need to have that many users have that kind of access? And when someone quits, is there a clear, obvious offboarding process, or leaves the Salesforce instance? Maybe they change roles and they're not necessary to have access to Salesforce anymore. Deprovisioning, similar, but this might be changing their access if they change roles within Salesforce. Lisa kind of hinted at it either. They may have more privilege than they need. Are we making sure they take away that privilege they don't need anymore? Who's making changes in the organization? Are you looking at that, right? And I mentioned before, the third-party integrations applications, are they secure? Any reputable organization can provide you documentation and tell you how they're securing their data. Make sure you know what that is, right? What about your current access controls? Like, are your sharing rules still valid? Are there some weird stuff going on there? Did someone add something? Take a look at that stuff. Have you looked at your login logs? Are people logging in, stuff going on there? You can take a look at that history and see if there's strange behaviors or applications you're not familiar with connecting in. So then you can trace them back and just validate that they're all legitimate, right? And what about reports? Running as other users is an opportunity to also have data leakage, right? So are they still relevant? Are they still the right things to do? So from an audit perspective, and this is not a comprehensive list, you could probably come up with a bunch of things you should be doing that I didn't document here that are valid things to do periodically. The one thing I would say is definitely periodically doing that. And there are some tools and stuff we're talking about in a little bit that help you do some of the stuff that we're just talking about. Right. And this quote clearly kind of all those different things I start thinking about. It does require a layer of defense, right? You have to have things in there. So
now I want to introduce you this security maturity matrix. Just like progressing through different belts in karate, taekwondo, or other martial arts discipline, advancing your Salesforce security skills and adopting the zero trust strategy involves recognizing your current level and then charting a path to the next. And we wanted to give you a visual where you can identify where you are right now, which can help you define what next tools and best practices you need to get to the next level. You can't use all of them at once. You can't go from the white belt to the black belt overnight. You need to build your skill sets. You need to build your arsenal. If you are at the entry level, you might be just getting acquainted with Salesforce security. Perhaps you just moved your company to MFA, multi-factor authentication, but maybe you don't have any other basics covered yet, and that's okay. At this stage, your goal is acknowledge it and recognize potential threats, and then set the foundation for growth. Yes, I hope You planned on stretching first. Thanks, Eric. Yes, absolutely. I skipped a few belts here, but you got the idea. Moving up at the next level, you might be already putting some of your admin knowledge, certified admin knowledge into the practice. You are implementing fundamentals of security measures like role-based access control, permission sets. Perhaps you're delving into more advanced techniques such as continuous monitoring or data encryption. You start raising the importance of consistent audits, as Mark has pointed out, security reviews. So you are evolving your approach to address a broader range of potential threats. And as you are approaching the mastery level, you move into the proactive approach. You are actively monitoring your user behaviors. You are detecting anomalies and fine-tuning your security measures. Your focus is on staying ahead of threats and adapting. You have implemented processes to enforce security practices. Maybe you're not only implementing advanced measures, but also measures in contributing to the security community. And the black belt, what I want to point it out, that it can look differently for a small organization with one admin versus an enterprise level company with a large Salesforce team. So take this chart as your general guideline, not as a step-by-step instruction. And the key is really to recognize where you stand and acknowledge that it is perfectly fine. Each level has its significance, and growth is a process. It's a continuous process. Identify your current belt in terms of Salesforce strategy and zero trust. Then consider your company's risks. Consider your risks, maybe discuss them with your leadership, discuss them with the industry experts, your internal security teams, and now you can plan your next steps. Learn, adopt new techniques. So remember, it's about the journey, the progress, and the collective effort to enhance your Salesforce security. And with that, we will dive into some very specific tools you should know about on your journey to your black belts. So we will start with some basics, but I still want to outline these tools. These tools form the bedrock of your ability to safeguard the data and ensure a secure environment. And even though this could be very basic to some of you, I think it is worth repeating to ensure that everyone is familiar with these 3 levels of data access in Salesforce. So we start with object level security. It is the foundation where admins create custom profiles and sets adhering to the principles of least privilege. By granting users the minimum essential access required by the roles, you're minimizing the risks. And a quick reminder that Salesforce has officially announced their permissions on profiles have an end of life date, retirement due in spring 26 release. And even though it sounds like it is so far away, we all should start planning for it. Permission set groups allows us to group permission sets and manage them more efficiently. And muting permission sets let us mute undesired without revoking the whole set. With field level security, as admins, we hold the keys to determine who can access specific fields. We can utilize profiles and permission sets, but also customize page layouts and dynamic forms to present only relevant data and reduce the exposure. The record level security, there's a lot going on here. And I'm sure you're already familiar with this triangle. I've always still remind myself or visualize it when I'm thinking of a record level access. It starts with the baseline access of org-wide defaults to defining who can access what data at a broad level. Then we open up access through role hierarchy, which allows us to align data access closer to the organization's needs and open up data to managers of the role. Then we open up access even further with sharing rules to public groups and queues by sharing records based on the specific criteria and specific needs, common needs. And the next layer is manual sharing and Apex managed sharing, where we fine-tune access to more unique use cases that cannot be achieved with previous. Apply this with caution, as we want to eliminate one-off scenarios. And Apex managed sharing, of course, involves custom code, which needs to be supported. And we can't forget about two more special tools. That's territory management. It is used for more complex organization and allows tailored record access based on geographical or organizational divisions. It is a slightly different layer that goes on top of already covered record level security tools here. And restriction rules allow to limit access. These rules let us determine when and where sharing is denied, ensuring compliance with security policies. So now let's dive into more advanced features. Mark, take it away.
So I started talking, I was muted. Apologies. So let's talk about some of the built-in stuff that you probably are familiar with some of these things. So I mentioned earlier from auditing. So one of the key things you should be doing is auditing your organization to make sure you're managing that risk. You can't eliminate risk. Keep that in mind. Somebody really wants to steal your car, they'll bring you in, right? There's something, so much you can only do, but you should do as much as you can. So again, set up audit history. Who's making changes to what? Are they inadvertently changing access? Well, again, logins. Are they logging in? You can export that if you want to. Look at the sharing access on the object. You can verify access for a particular field on the field definition, see who has access to that things. And keep in mind that one of the best practices is that you should be, as much as possible, creating unique users for each of your integrations if it's possible. And Salesforce actually has embraced that best practice by providing now 5 free integration users. So those are 5 integration user licenses automatically. I don't know if the smallest orgs have those, but I know most orgs do get them, and you should use them. Have your own specific access set up for those. And the other benefit for that is if something gets changed in your organization, if you're using a shared integration user, you can't tell which system did it. Having a unique one helps you track that down in case something doesn't go so well. All right, you do have classic encryption, which is officially a kind of a security tool, but it's more about compliance because you use the permission set to see everything, and you really can't control it. The better access control for fields that are encrypted is really the stuff that Alicia just described. You could also take advantage of set expirations. So I mentioned earlier, at least privilege. Sometimes somebody needs privileges for a little while, and you may want to grant them that. So my current organization, that's what we do. We have a very limited number of admins, but sometimes I need to go and install an app or whatever in production. I put a request, so we have a process. I'm granted them a privilege for a time period. After that time period expires, I go back to my previous privilege. That way, we don't have all these admins in the organization mucking about, right? And there's actually a couple of tools that Salesforce provides. User Permission Analyzer, which is an app you can install supported. And it's actually one of the official tools you're supposed to be using to prepare for that migration to permission. I'll talk about that in a moment. And there's also user access policies, which is in beta right now, which allows you to provision and deprovision users, as I mentioned earlier. These are tools that are available. One's in beta, the other one's still being developed, but these are tools that are out there you can currently use now. And let's take a quick look at one of those. So this is what the user access policy looks like as an example. All right, so you have the opportunity to name it, obviously, and then you have a trigger type. So it's kind of like a flow a little bit. So you can think of this as a workflow or an automation, but specific to users and provisioning. So you could create an update you fire it off on, or an update. So you have these different opportunities, and then you could actually have filters that you use to determine what qualifies that user for that particular policy to kick off. So you use a permission set definition as well as fields on the user record itself. And then once those things are determined, you could actually grant or revoke access to any of these items listed in this bullet. So you could actually automatically give people access to a queue or permission set. So you could actually assign people to a certain permission set, and that could actually trigger off other things going on, or permission set group things too. So it's a pretty powerful tool to actually help you provision. It requires planning and requires making sure you kind of have a consistent I guess mechanisms and permissioning done in place, but you can take advantage and make your life easier to provision as well as deprovision people. So pretty kind of cool tool from that. This is the other item I mentioned earlier. This is a user permission analyzer. It's an app you install into your organization that does actually analysis on your users. It's really cool if it works. Currently, it doesn't work. I just have this running in our UAT environment, and it ain't working. It's choking. I reached out to Salesforce, our team. They reached out to product management. The latest release, something broke in it. So when it works, it's pretty spiffy. So what's supposed to happen on this page is when you choose Analyze by User and you choose a user, the list of standard objects, custom objects, set entity, user permissions, all that stuff show up, and it shows you how they got access, through what permission sets and profiles they got access to those objects and stuff. So it's really powerful. So if you want to understand who has access to what, you can just go in here and do that. Pick a user, and it'll show you exactly how they got to where. There's YouTube videos directly from Salesforce product team that show you how this works. This is free. This is an app you can install. Right? In addition to that, there's a couple other tabs in this app. Converter, which exactly sounds like it says, converts a profile to a permission set. Dirty little secret, every single profile is already a permission set. They already have one. Salesforce does it automatically. You can run reports that analyze some of this data for yourself, export it, especially for larger data sets. And manage is just another way to help manage your assignments to different groups and permission sets. Another UI to do that in. So this helps you optimize and control. But I think to me, the permission analyzer and the reporting are kind of the key things here, because sometimes you want to understand how someone got access to something, and it's really hard to figure out because the permission sets of profiles are all over the place. You have lots of those. But this tool, when it's working, will actually show you that. So it's a good way to handle that. Right. Now, these are additional other tools that may or may not require investment. I think some of these are free. One of the items you may not be familiar with, and I've used this already a few times, is Salesforce historical events logs. So this is a pay for service you can do. And what it does is you actually buy from Salesforce the click log of a user per week. And it goes back up to 30 days. So Salesforce tracks every click you do. Every single click is tracked, right? So you could actually pull a log of that information from Salesforce 30 days. I actually did this. We had, in a previous life, we had some folks leave the organization. Senior leadership approached me and says, these two guys who left, we're not sure this is all on the up and up. They were kind of suspicious about if they did anything before they left. So can you go back and see what they did? I said, yeah, I could pull these logs. It costs us money. It wasn't crazy expensive. So I pulled the logs, and one was clear, but the other one, sure enough, ran some reports that no reason. There's another question about why they have access to that report. That's another problem. But they pulled a report that had no reason pulling. There was no reason. And actually, that went to legal, and letters were sent, and all kinds of stuff like that happened. It's a pretty powerful tool to help manage that risk too, right? User access permission system, actually just had in the previous slide. I have it twice. I should delete it. I forgot to. There are other third-party apps. There's a perm comparator. That's a Heroku app that allows you to compare permissions and profiles. It hasn't been updated recently, I don't think, so it's decent. The Permissioner is another app that someone recommended me recently. It's another UI to help you assign permissions easier and quicker, and it's free. And that's on my list of things to install in one of our development sandboxes and kind of take a look at it, see if it is that much better or not. But it was recommended to me recently. And the last item, additional investment, transaction security policies. This is actually, when we talk about auditing and monitoring, this is a really powerful tool. So, so what this does, and can you go to the next slide, please? Again, this is an investment you have to purchase, but this allows you to create your own policies. This is an actual copy of the screenshot from our production environment. There's nothing here client specific, so that's why I was able to do that. But what happens is this is actually listening for any users getting assigned modify all data through a permission set. Right. So a couple of things to point out here. Here's a description, name of the thing, the events. So a permission set event store, that's actually a large, big object that Salesforce gives you automatically as part of these kind of things, where it stores every single event that happens for permission set. And what happens is you set up this policy that listens for specific kinds of events. I don't have the conditions on the screen here. There's another screen where they actually manage those conditions. And you can also build a policy not only with this UI, which is what the policy type condition builder says. You can also write Apex to do really sophisticated stuff for your policies if you wanted to, if you have the developer resources available. But you don't need to. This policy is all point and click and drag. Like I was able to set this up I had to look at the code to figure out the values, but we got to work. And what's also really cool about it is that this allows you to have an action. So it says none or block. So you can allow that access to continue. The policy can say okay, but you notice to the right side there's a notification, which we have turned on a email notification, and we set up actually a mailbox shared by the key leaders in the organization to know, to go see, because sometimes people do get modified all for legitimate reasons. We don't stop it, but we want to know when it happens. So we actually have a separate mailbox for those emails to go in. So this is a really powerful tool. This is still in beta pilot. Can't remember what they're calling it. So things I wish they don't have it yet. So is the fact that you can give an object level modify all. That's in a permission set. Now that event will happen in the store, permission set event store. A record gets created. This person got a view all on the account object, but I can't create a condition to pick that up yet. So the conditions, what they listen for, is more limited right now. I'm hoping they adjust that because, as you would imagine, and you probably are in the same situation, there are some objects that we care more about than others that we want to make sure stay secure. So and this is a really great tool to actually keep things secure because it can block you if necessary based on those kind of changes. Right. And a couple other things to think about trying out and doing. Seed your database. And what does that mean? Put in a record or two that will go to you. If someone takes it and sends emails out or mails things, I've done that. And that's how I detected that sometimes we had a compromise where I got an email from somebody using a fake name to my email address, and I knew that fake name was in my seeded data. It's like, huh. So that I went back and traced and see what happened. And I did figure out exactly what happened. There was somebody who left who took data. And I took it to leadership, let them know that happened. I mentioned earlier in code, some people will have plain text names. Salesforce has a mechanism to secure your passwords and usernames called name credentials. Use them, right? The audits I mentioned earlier, you should be doing them. Schedule them. Put it on your calendar. You don't have to do everything, but do something periodically. Check on your organization and your health. It's not as sexy and fun as building solutions and creating objects and all that cool stuff, but it's probably just as important. I would argue maybe more important because if no one trusts a database, who's going to use it, right? So you got to make sure it stays secure. And depending on your organization, partner with your InfoSec team, information security, or similar departments, and see what kind of policies or procedures they have in place, and make sure you work with them, right? Rotate any integration credentials, client ID and secrets. I believe on AWS, which is a data cloud services, is requiring now that their customers rotate their key and a secret. It's just the way they connect their credentials every, I think, 3 months now. To keep it fresh. And Salesforce actually recommends memory serves every year. You should minimally rotate your secret and key. So those are good ideas because who knows where information gets to, right? If you have a lot of admins, you have to ask yourself why. Can you leverage delegated admins? I had a previous organization where we had a partner team with partners, and we create partner users, and all the admins did it. And we realized that the amount of work that created for us was a lot. And there was a team already managed the partner, delegated some of that functionality to them, very limited, but they were able to manage that, and they were quicker, and the customer experience is better for everybody. So use delegated admins when it makes sense. If you don't know what implicit sharing is, you probably need to go figure that out. Implicit sharing has caused me a headache at times where we've actually had records show up in the communities because implicit sharing, we didn't realize that. So implicit sharing basically means based on the role hierarchies or other sharing, that case versus an account. Someone has access to the same account, they may automatically get access to another case that they should have normally access to. It's not about implicit sharing, but if you don't know what implicit sharing is, you should probably take a look at that. And talking about sharing, the models of sharing that Salesforce uses, specifically on partner community, not partner, regular communities, you have sharing sets, which is a completely different sharing model than you're typically used to that Alicia talked about earlier, as well as using data categories for knowledge if you don't use knowledge with the normal data model. The new knowledge concept allows you to use either data model if you like. So data categories offer some really cool flexibility, but it takes a while to get your brain wrapped around it. So, and it works with topics. So consider that if you wanted to. Make sure your users aren't sharing credentials. I've seen that a few times. Your integration user should be API only in case those credentials get leaked someplace else. They can't log in as a user at least, right? What is your role for who's making changes? Make sure you have a change control process in place. Train to communicate with users. Going back to what Lisa said earlier, it's everyone's responsibility for securing the organization, making sure we're following best practices. Apex, so coders. So if you have any coding going on in your organization, make sure they're following best practices. So code could run in godlike mode with full access to everything, which is, there are use cases where it's legitimate, has to happen, but that should be the exception, not the norm. So there's actually commands in Apex where you can actually lock in sharing or inherit sharing from other processes. And then in the actual theme Apex, make sure we are validating the user has access to modify those fields if necessary.
Wow, we went through a lot. Thank you so much, Mark. Covered a lot today. Coming close to the end of our presentation here, guys. We have one question or comment which we will cover in just a few minutes. But to close off the presentation, Mark, you mentioned you have some stories that you want to share with us.
So yeah, so managing the risk. So I kind of talked about one. Another situation I had was I worked in this organization, large organization, and we have a holiday shutdown. Wherever a company kind of shuts down, perfectly normal. And this president of sales and marketing, who reports to the CEO, approached me and asked me, "Hey, Mark, we're going on break. Can you give me a list of our customers so I could review the list of customers, put together a plan for next year?" So this guy is my boss's boss's boss. So what do I say? Yes, sure. He quit, took it to a competitor that week. Like, I did everything correctly. As soon as I found out he quit, I went to leadership and let him know. They did nothing about it as far as I know. But what do you do to prevent that? Legitimately, this person was my boss's like senior leadership, like C-suite level. And he took the data and went. So there's certain things that are going to happen. You just can't. So managing the risk is what it is. You can't stop it sometimes. Like I said earlier, if somebody wants to steal your car, they will. Another example I have is not as dramatic as that one. We had a weird use cases in another organization I worked for where they decided to bring in another company to help co-sell with. Instead of setting up a community for them, they actually wanted to be in Salesforce directly with their own users, yada, yada, yada. Fine. But they want to make sure the data stayed separate. They had their own data they're going to bring in. So they asked me to set it up. So I set up basically a very complex and robust role hierarchy. And I tested the S out of it to make sure it was working, where our company not see their data and their data, they could not see our data. Now, yes, the super high senior leadership, the partners at the top level, they could see across that the divide. But the actual rank and file sales organizations could not. I double checked, triple tested that, whatever. So role hierarchies is a really powerful way to secure data. Well, what happened was that company went under eventually. A couple years later, I was actually moved to the parent company and worked there. So that parent company inherited all the assets and problems of the first company. Well, that first company got sued by that partner they brought in and accused them of stealing the data. So what happened was I was approached by lawyers, of course, for lawsuits posed. And I thankfully, before we shut down the old Salesforce instance, because we're shutting it down to move this other organization because the company closed, I used a demand tool. I took a full copy of the whole database. I had it. And when I got deposed, I provided all the data in there, and they reviewed it to look at the role hierarchy stuff, and everything was secure. So I was told, he might have been a little hyperbole here. He told me I saved the company over $1 million by the position and showing them that with the right role hierarchy, I was able to prove and secure the data was safe and there was no cross-pollination, so that we never stole their data. So those are the kind of quick little stories to share.
Crazy stories, and thank you so much for sharing. So everyone, we are wrapping up here. We want to thank you for joining us today.